right, so I caught an episode of Autopsy, the last hours of Randy Savage. It was on the REELZ network. So, for those of you who are not familiar with this show, there's a forensic pathologist and medical examiner named Dr. Michael Hunter. And basically, he does autopsies on famous people, and he tries to figure out exactly what may have killed them. In this instance, Randy Savage died of a heart attack. So, in this episode, we're trying to figure out what may have caused his heart attack. There's a list of things that they're trying to look at here. Let's call them suspects. Let's treat this like a detective. So we have his diet, we have painkillers, we have HGH, we have steroids, we got stress, and we got the snake bite when he got bit by Jake Roberts. So they do a good job of going into the science behind each one of these things and which one of these things may have caused Randy Savage's heart attack. And they do this while also at the same time telling his life story, essentially. So we go through the history of, Randy Savage playing baseball and that sort of stuff. Rip Rogers is in this episode. Usually sometimes they have friends and family. So Lanny is in this episode, Lanny Poffo. Rip Rogers is in this episode. JP Zarka, editor of Pro Wrestling Stories. He's the pro wrestling aficionado historian for this episode, which is always kind of a question mark when they have like random wrestling historians. There's also a psychologist on this show. Her name is Dr. Papadopoulos. I think her first name is Paula Papadopoulos. I'm trying to look for her name now. Hold on. It's Linda. I don't know where the fuck I got Paula from, but it's Linda Papadopoulos. She's a psychologist. So they tell the story of Randy Savage, essentially where he was born, where he was raised, his father being a wrestler, his father running his own wrestling promotion. This is after Randy, of course, washed out from baseball. And so he told the old story of Randy breaking all of his baseball bats because he couldn't play baseball anymore. So then when we started talking about one of the first things that they went into, and that is that Randy started aging very young, is that he started losing his hair. And then so Dr. Hunter basically says that of men who are balding, 70% of them, especially on the crown of the head, have an increased rate of heart disease. 70% of them have an increased likelihood of heart disease. That's probably a more effective way of putting it. Now, of course, this is likelihoods and stuff like that. It doesn't mean that just because you're, I've seen people going bald at 22, 23. It doesn't mean you got heart disease. He's just saying that, balding is a sign of aging. And sometimes people age very fast because they're living stressful lives, or they have bad diets or something. They have some type of medical problem. And I've seen guys age very fast. I've seen dudes who are in their mid-20s with gray hair. I've seen dudes 18 with 3 kids, face look like a wash rag afterwards. I mean, just talking, guys just looks dry in the face. He look like droopy. So that kind of thing is what he's talking about. And of course, Randy Savage was in a situation where, of course, wrestling is a visual medium. So you got this guy who is, balding early in his life. And so he took to wearing hats all the time. And, Lanny talked about how he hated to be seen without his hats because he was very sensitive about his bald spot. It made him look old. And, of course, this leads into the story of Vince McMahon eventually making fun of his bald spot. And that being like what really drove Randy Savage away from him was the bald spot and the How's Liz line from the what is that, Billionaire Ted skits. Those weren't mentioned here. They kind of jumped back and forth around his wrestling career. Like they went immediately from IWA to jumped all the way to his time as being WWF champion. Elizabeth was mentioned here too. But she was an ancillary member of this conversation. She wasn't really like a major part of it. So of course they talked about his drawing power. Wrestling is a visual medium. I've said that 100 times. So basically, Dr. Hunter talked about, okay, well, for a wrestler, you have to look at Randy. He's expected to have a lot of bulk and a lot of muscle, and that and these things rather take a lot to maintain. And so we started looking into Randy's diet. that Randy, and as a good detective, they say, okay, well, Randy had took out his mom to for Mother's Day. He took her out to eat. While he was there, Lanny was there as well. They noticed that Randy had a steak, and then they started, well, he's a wrestler. Of course, he has plenty of protein. He has tons of protein, and so they started breaking down Randy's diet. That as a guy who was eating a lot of protein, they said, well, high protein foods bring a lot of sodium, fat, and sugar, which increase heart disease, and that sometimes Randy was a 2 or 3 steaks a day kind of guy, and that he was one of the guys who would blend a dozen eggs and drink them throughout the day. So he was packing protein, and so the doctor starts like, there's there's a nutrient called choline, and that it's healthy, but too much of course, and excess is dangerous, and because it can block the artery walls of your heart. He says that a human male only needs about 500 grams of choline a day, and you can get a lot of this stuff from milk, meat, and eggs. So milk, meat, and eggs creates choline in your body, can help block your arteries. And he says one large steak can give you 600 milligrams of choline. A dozen eggs will give you 1,500. So if Randy Savage was eating a dozen eggs a day, he was getting over 3 times the amount of choline that he needs for his heart. And, the doctor says, well, in the ring, during his wrestling years, he would have worked off of most of that. Whatever protein he was, downing, he would have worked most of it off training and working. But the issue is he continued his diet after retirement. He was retired for 10 years before he died. So you talk about this guy who was, in his 50s, and he's still packing protein, and he had, and since he, of course, we talked more about this later when he talked about the bulking of the steroids and the HGH and stuff like that. And he says that this kind of stuff can, let's jump back to the choline. I don't want to confuse anybody. So to talk about the choline, he talked about the plaque buildup in your arteries, and that it could cause calcified osteosclerosis, and which Randy Savage did have when he died, and that he had severe osteosclerosis in his heart, and that his diet likely factored into that. Continuing with his heart and his likelihood of what things that affect the heart, they talked about his anabolic steroid use. For those of people who didn't know, Randy Savage, they showed the clip, admitted to using steroids in the early 90s. He said his exact words were he experimented with anabolic steroids, yeah, but he stopped doing it, and because it helps you bulk up. But steroids, for those of you who don't know, anabolic steroids mimic testosterone, which is a naturally occurring thing inside of males. So it kind of sends people who are on steroids into another, kind of like a second puberty, where you get increased muscle mass and a deeper voice. And you can look, they say basically through a visual test, you can basically look at Randy Savage and see that he was bigger than his frame would handle. And that, and Lanny, they talked about steroids a little bit. Lanny Poffo said, look, I never seen him do them. But, Rip Roberts just says like, hey, I never seen him do them either, but it was pretty much accepted in the wrestling business in the 70s and 80s that, they wouldn't say go take steroids. What they would say is, we're concerned about your size. And that nobody ever said you needed to do it, but it was clear that you were rewarded for doing it. And not just in the WWF, obviously in other promotions as well. And so then we talked about testosterone in general, and testosterone can help control your mood. And that Randy Savage was known for being highly stressed and highly agitated. And they talked about him getting into fights outside the ring. They only talked about one, which is his Waffle House fight, where he got the dog sicked on him. Basically, he got into a fight with a guy in a Waffle House because the guy was happy about being married and Randy was being sour about something. Then the guy pulled a knife on Randy. Because the guy pulled a knife on him, Randy wanted to kill the guy. And then the cops were called. The cops showed up with dogs, and they sicked the dogs on him. He got bit. and he had those scars for the rest of his life and all that type of stuff. But they basically showed that as one of the many times that Randy Savage really just kind of gets amped up outside of the ring. Like he's not uh, a person who turns it on and turns it off. Like he was on all the time. Like he was already agitated, like literally all the time. And it might have been from steroid use, but it also might have been from just him being an excitable person. But the doctor says basically that testosterone, not only does it control your mood, but it keeps your body hyped up. It keeps you stressed, which is something we're going to talk about later. But he says it also puts a lot of can cause permanent damage to your heart, your blood vessels, and your heart muscles. And even if he stopped doing it in 1990 or 1991 when he admitted to doing it, even if he had stopped before then, if he only doing it for 2 years, it could have caused permanent damage to his heart. So don't do steroids, kids. Do not do steroids. So then we start talking about his painkiller use. So apparently, Randy, as he got older, as old wrestlers tend to do, his body hurt. He was having really bad issues with his knees. He had suffered a torn meniscus. I got it right that time. Torn meniscus in 1998 from a flying elbow drop he did from the top rope. He tore his meniscus. Apparently, they had to give away one of his secrets, that he used to land on his knees in order to not hurt his opponent. He would land on his knees. So that's how he ended up tearing his knees up. Just like Hulk Hogan would land on his hip in order to stop killing his opponent from a leg drop. And all of a sudden, Hogan has bad hips. Same thing. Randy Savage jumps from the top rope. 20 years of dropping the big elbow. He has to land on his knees. So he's tore his knees up. So the doctor says, like, okay, he's got severe damage to his knees. He's got torn meniscus. He's had 3 surgeries. He had 2 scars on his knees, both from the surgeries in 1998. And that he was prescribed hydrocodone, which is a powerful painkiller for his knee injuries. And essentially, he never really stopped using hydrocodone in his entire life. He died in 2011. So this was 1998. He started using hydrocodone in 1998. And he died in 2011. And the doctor says, look, Randy probably should have retired in 1998. But as we know, he was still wrestling in 2000. So he continued to go. So they says in 2001, Randy Savage was still wrestling. He was nearly 50. And this is where, you get the doctor. She comes in, the psychologist. She comes in and basically starts talking about, toxic masculinity. He doesn't want to ask for help. Being the strongest, being the toughest, now part of his identity and his personality. And then they talked about something that I really didn't think that much about. That when he did Spider-Man, there's 2 different things about when he did Spider-Man. One, when he did Spider-Man, he did a scene where, Spider-Man flipped him over. And they showed the clip of him landing on his head. And he said they had to do that take 5 or 10 times. Lanny talked about like, hey, he had to get flipped over on his head numerous times for this one scene. And he was over 50 by the time he did this, by the way. Because this movie came out in 2003, 2004. So Randy Savage was well over 50. And he rejected the idea of using a stunt double. He's like, I'm the macho man. Oh, yeah, I don't need no stunt double. I can do this. No big deal. And he said the repeated impacts on his head and neck likely damaged his spine. And then Lanny talked about how Randy had problems turning his head. That he would always turn his whole upper body. Like in his later years, before he died, he would turn his whole upper body. Because he always had these problems with his head and his neck. But he was rich, so he would always have like masseuses and things like that work his neck out for him and stretch him. And he was okay, but he limited the use of his neck. And they also talked about how he also used hydrocodone. That he had already been using it, and he likely increased his usage of it once he got injured during the movie. So they say the long-term use of hydrocodone can cause damage to the heart, damaging your electrical impulses in your heart, causing an irregular heartbeat or what they call arrhythmia, which can cause your blood to pump inconsistently in one way or the other, either too fast or too slow. And so they said, well, by the time he was fully retired, and this was before, of course, he even did Spider-Man, he was well on his way to having heart problems, just based off of the hydrocodone, the steroids, and the various stresses that he had going on in his life. So this is where we get talking about HGH. So when Randy Savage was offered the role in Spider-Man, he was, of course, an older guy, and he wasn't the Macho Man anymore. He had been retired for years already, so he couldn't use steroids because steroids were illegal. So he used human growth hormone, which was legal at the time. And you could actually use HGH in WWE at the time too, because I remember Edge got busted for HGH, and I think Triple H did. I think Rey Mysterio also did, and I think maybe even Kurt Angle got busted with HGH. But human growth hormone is a naturally occurring peptide hormone which controls body growth, and it can cause acromegaly, which is what you call giantism. Acromegaly is what Lars Sullivan had, where he had like those exceptionally large hands, the exceptionally weird head and jaw. Big Show has it too. You could it's called giantism. And they said, acromegaly can be caused by you using human growth hormone, and that it also can enlarge your heart. So, and you can have what's called cardiomegaly. And they said that Randy Savage's heart was found to be twice the size of a man his age's heart should be, and that he had two blocked arteries that were 90% blocked, which caused muscle scarring and caused his heart to become enlarged. So he had blocked arteries in his heart. His heart got bigger, and it caused essentially this is what caused his heart attack. But it wasn't just one thing; it was a myriad of things. So they also talked about stress, and basically the amount of stress that he was dealing with inside the ring and out. They didn't go into any details about Elizabeth, but they talked about him being married to Elizabeth. It would have been a nice spot for him to put in that Randy, how paranoid he was about Elizabeth, that everybody talks about it. Lanny kind of says that isn't real, but this is an interesting thing here because they talked about stress levels and cortisol. So basically, cortisol is a natural hormone that is released during stress. It helps. It's part of your, I think it's part of your flight or fight sensation, and it increases your blood pressure, your blood sugars, your fatty acids, and your blood cholesterol. And that Randy Savage was in a constant state of stress because he was stressed out inside the ring because he had to be. As part of his gimmick was to be the macho man, and constantly on edge all the time. But he was also constantly on edge at home due to his strenuous relationship with his wife. So they say he was in constant stress in and outside the ring. And this, of course, this when they started talking about the Waffle House fight, and there were other fights that Randy Savage were in throughout his entire life. But of course, one fight is not gonna, unless you were killed in the fight, it's not gonna kill you. But he's just lived a very stressful life. And Papadopoulos talked about, well, acting angry makes you actually angry sometimes. And then Rip Rogers told a story about, Randy Savage just being agitated all the time, punching holes in the wall. That he would get real angry and he would punch the holes in the wall. And people would think like you were talking about, or they building up to the story of talking about steroids, right? And they did. They kind of was building up to like, okay, we know you're going to talk about steroids. We know we're going to get there, but let's tell this other stuff first. But and Rip Rogers was one of his training buddies, by the way. I should have mentioned that from the beginning. He's probably like, why is Rip Rogers in here? It's because he was he was in IWA with Randy Savage. So basically, they talked about they were married for 10 years, Randy and Elizabeth. Elizabeth wanted out of the business, and Randy, of course, was just really getting hot at the time. And he didn't want to leave. And that was, according to Lanny, that was the reason they got divorced, is that Randy was holding on to his career. He couldn't hold on to his career and Liz at the same time. Of course, that's weird to say considering Liz went to WCW after this, and I, I just don't see how. I don't see that one just doesn't pass the smell test. I'm pretty sure like the money might have been good enough to make her forget about it, but uh, you know, I don't know, dog. I don't know about that one, dog. So they did throw out one thing out there that was just kind of them stunting on us by, showing off their little fancy medical degrees. They talked about the snake bite. There was no real reason to talk about the snake bite because obviously did not kill Randy Savage because it was like 20 years after he got bit by this snake. But it was actually something very interesting that was said. Because he talked about, the doctors basically said like, look, a bite from a cobra can kill you, obviously. But obviously, Jake's cobra was defanged. There was no venom. But you can catch Shawinella, which is a polymicrobial disease. Polymicrobial disease. It consists of a combination of viruses, fungi, bacteria, and parasites, which can affect the blood. And Lanny said that Randy did get a 103 temperature from getting bit by that snake. He got a high, very, very high fever from getting bit by the snake. So obviously he did have some type of illness that he's able to fight off from the snake. So that was just something that they was throwing out there that really obviously had nothing to do with him dying. But of course, the stress levels and stuff like that can be downplayed because in his later years he wasn't wrestling anymore. He had gotten remarried, so the stress of social life kind of went down. He was doing charity work, which he really loved doing, but he was still eating bad. He still had was using hydrocodone because he had pain in his neck and his knees and stuff like that. 20 years and 30 years of wrestling was terrible on his heart, so he didn't have a drug overdose, but the amount of things that he had done to his body from stress and bad dieting and taking various medications and stuff like that is what caused his heart to enlarge and blocked his arteries. So what he was eating was blocking his arteries and caused all this type of swelling in his heart. And ultimately, while he was driving, he basically fell unconscious and died. And Lynn, who was his wife, took control of the vehicle from the passenger seat and drove it into the tree. And she said she wasn't on the episode, so, but basically they said like her quick thinking saved a lot of people's lives because he essentially fell asleep at the wheel, but he essentially died right there, But I think he was in the hospital for a long time, but he was essentially dead. And so it was educational. It was very, very interesting, and it was sad. But this was a fantastic episode of REELZ Last Hours of Randy Savage. So it was no single cause of his heart attack. It was just how we do. We abuse our bodies throughout our life and not thinking too much about it. And then when we get 50, 60 years old, that stuff starts to catch up with you. All the chicken wings you ate, all the cheeseburgers, and especially if you're eating that stuff still, and you're sedentary, you're not working out as much as you used to, you're not as fit as you used to. Like, he's in great shape. Like they said, his corpse was in pretty good shape for a guy his age, but his insides were not that great. He just had he had acromegaly and he has cardiomegaly and stuff like that. He had all types of scarring in his heart and everything. It was real bad. But it was interesting. Like, it was very, very interesting. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel. If you like what I do, send me cash via the Cash App. If you want to put me on the payroll, you can go to Subscribestar, $5 a month. I appreciate that. Thank you guys for your time. Randy Macho Man Savage is one of the GOATs. And I thank him for everything that he did. And I'll talk to you guys later, man. Peace.